Hello, everybody. We are going to talk about agriculture. As I've already said, we are doing this unit a little bit differently. So instead of me lecturing in class, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to record all of the different lectures and put them onto Canvas. You will be responsible for accessing them, listening to them, taking notes on the packet that's been provided to you, and then we are going to use class time specifically to do more activity-based stuff. Okay, so the content is something that you are responsible for. If you have questions, please, of course, always ask me. But let's just jump right in. This is Unit 5, Chapter 9 in your textbook, and we are talking about agriculture and rural land use. So these sections, the pictures that look like this in our slideshow, talk specifically about what the enduring understanding, big idea kind of thing is that we need to take out away from this particular section of our lecture. And so today, or for this first part, we are talking specifically about the availability of resources and cultural practices influence agricultural practices and land use patterns. Okay, so if we think about the environment, the availability of resources within that environment, and then the culture of the people who live in that location are all going to come together to actually influence what types of agriculture are performed and then how the people choose to use the land. And we are going to give you some examples and see what that actually looks like. Okay. All right, continue. So this is just topic 5.1, Introduction to Agriculture. There again is our enduring understanding, the availability of resources and cultural practices, influence agricultural practices and land use patterns. All right. Now, one thing I do want to point out, a lot of these slides are going to be sort of duplications. So what happened was I pulled a slideshow from a colleague. She had some put together. And so I borrowed hers, and then I had also made some slides of my own, and I liked both of them. They kind of both hit different things, and so even on the same topic. And so I kept them both in. So if it feels like some of these slides seem repetitive in content, they are. But I believe that the way that they are both presented and the graphics that are used and all that kind of stuff will help you pick up different information, even though the content is ultimately the same. Okay, so if you feel like we're talking about the same thing over and over again, you are not wrong. All right, so let's start here. Physical geography and agriculture. When we talk specifically about physical geography, that is the actual stuff of the land. Okay, the soil and the trees, what the weather's like, what the climate zone is. Is it mountainous? Is it flat? Are there grasslands? All of those actual physical features obviously are going to influence the agriculture that can be performed in those regions. So the question is, how are agricultural regions influenced by the natural environment? And then, how do people alter the landscape to make agriculture possible? What you're going to see in these pictures are different forms of agriculture where people have kind of taken what they've been given and adjusted it to use for what they need. So up here, this top picture is a reservoir or a lake. The bottom one is that same lake later in the year. Okay, so this is from January 25th, 2007. The bottom picture is from March 8th, 2007. Obviously, they are using the water in that lake to irrigate crops. Okay, so water gets pumped from the lake to various fields around the area so that they can irrigate and grow crops. Down here, this picture is something called slash and burn farming, where what happens is people come in and they clear out a huge area of land. They cut all the trees down. They kind of come through with big plows and kind of turn up all the land, till the soil, and then they burn everything. The idea of burning, when you burn stuff, you actually are putting additional nutrients, carbon, nitrogen, stuff like that, back into the soil. And then when you till that all together, it actually makes for very good, rich soil. Unfortunately, when you do that, it only lasts for a couple of years. And so every 2 to 3 years, these slash and burn farmers actually have to move to a new plot of land, tear everything down, cut all the trees down, till everything up, burn everything again. And so this style of farming is actually not very sustainable because you're constantly needing to find new sources to burn. And that is actually a very leading cause of something called deforestation. This one right here, you guys, I'm sure, have seen things similar, right? Irrigation, where you've got sprinklers running through fields in order to water crops. And then this over here, this is actually a picture of rice paddies. I think that picture specifically is from Vietnam. But you can see how the mountains have been leveled into what are called terraces. Those terraces are then flooded, and rice actually grows underwater. And so these are rice paddies that you are seeing. All right. So all of these are really good examples of how people have to, kind of take into consideration what is being given them by their natural environment, and then how they can also alter it to make the various types of agriculture that they want to perform available and actuality in their region. All right, so agricultural requirements. Bottom line, you guys, I think you guys don't have Miss McKinnell this year, do you? I'm not sure which grade is it. Who is it that does the Chia Pets? Anyway, doesn't matter. But but you have all probably come to at some point, planted a seed or spiked a potato and put it in some water, right? You understand the basic components that plants need to grow. And really what it comes down to is water, sun, and some sort of soil or food. So when you think of agriculture in California, what do you think of? Now, I'm from California, so I know a lot of what happens there. I'm specifically from Northern California, and in Northern California, it is wine country. So there are acres and acres acres and acres and acres of grapes, specifically, grapes for wine. We also have orchards. Where I'm from specifically, there's a lot of pear orchards. Very close to me, they do berries as well, strawberries and blackberries specifically. If you get further south, then you're going to run into avocados, onions. Okay, a lot of the food that actually feeds the United States comes from the Central California Valley, and a lot of the water resources in the Western United States goes to California specifically for this agriculture. But in China, agriculture looks a lot different. In China, we see a lot of rice. Part of that is cultural, right? Rice is a big staple in China. They don't eat a whole lot of bread because they don't live in a region where wheat grows. And so they eat rice. The things that they make are made out of rice. Rice is a staple food in a very similar way that bread is a staple food for us. Okay, their carb or their basic, served at every meal kind of thing is rice, where ours is bread. All right, moving along. So agricultural products and climate. There are similarities between agriculture maps and climate maps. Go figure, right? You can only grow the types of agriculture that are conducive to your climate. If you have a crop that requires lots of water and lots of sun, you are not going to plant it in, probably not in the northwestern United States, where you can get lots of water, but you're not going to get a whole lot of sun. And you probably also wouldn't plant it down in Arizona because you don't have a lot of water, even though you have a lot of sun. Okay, so you can only grow what is conducive to your climate. If you look on page 316 and 317 in your textbook, specifically compare the climate maps and the agricultural region maps, and you will see what I'm talking about. Talk yourself through these ideas. What are the similarities that you see? Are the maps, this is actually something even more important to consider. Are the maps more similar or less similar if you're looking at developing countries? So specifically look at countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia. Are they more or less similar, those agricultural maps and the climate map? And then same question for developed countries, specifically the United States and Europe. Are those agricultural maps more or less similar in developed countries? Okay, and then talk yourself through this big question. Why do you think these correlations exist? If you can answer this question right here, it will set you up for success for the whole rest of the unit, because the answer to this question really is what we're trying to get across. Why do correlations exist between climate and agriculture, and where correlations do not exist, why don't they? Okay, and we need to be able to answer that question. All right, so here's the maps. This looks like, I can't tell if this is, I think this is climate. Let me just move my map a little bit. Oh. No, this is your agriculture map. Okay, so here's your agriculture map. Let me shrink it a little bit so I can actually see the key. You'll notice over here, you've got developing countries, developed countries, so you can see the difference on how they work. And then these are all the different types of agriculture within those countries and where you find them. Okay. All right, so this is kind of one of these big ideas. It's a little bit confusing. It is super important that we understand what it means. Okay, so agricultural land use and techniques. There are 4 categories, or 4 indicators, I guess. 2 for land use and 2 for technique. And they can go together, right? So agricultural land use and techniques are defined by the extent to which they reflect something called subsistence or commercial practices, or intensive or extensive use of land. Okay, so let's define what that looks like. Intensive land use is agriculture that involves greater inputs of capital and labor relative to the space being used. So think about the garden is small and the work required within that small garden is extensive, okay? These are going to be things like, we call it market gardening, which are like berries and olives and things that you would find in your supermarket, okay? Extensive land use is agriculture that uses fewer inputs of capital and paid labor. Okay, so capital meaning money or technology. Fewer inputs of capital and paid labor relative to the space being used. So fewer people, less money across a much wider area. So extensive is going to be like big grain farms, wheat fields, corn fields, soybean fields, right? These kind of big, this would be ranching, that kind of stuff. Subsistence farming, so techniques. Subsistence farming is where you are specifically paying or planting and harvesting specifically to feed your family. Okay, your goal is that I'm going to grow food so that I can feed my family. Commercial farming is where you're growing food to sell for profit, right? It is your business. You are, you only grow wheat and you do it on an extensive scale, and you harvest the wheat and you sell it off to market, okay? You don't harvest the wheat and then grind it down and make it into flour and store the flour in your food storage, right? It's not to feed your family. It's to make a profit. It's your business. Now, one of the tricky things, you will find all categories in both developing and developed countries. So you can have intensive subsistence, extensive commercial, extensive subsistence, intensive commercial. Okay, all of these different things can go together, which gets confusing. It's almost like the agriculture unit's version of nation and state, right? Multi-nation state, multi-state nation, nation state, state, nation, nationalism, nationality, right? All of those different things that seemed so confusing, but they had very specific definitions. This is chapter 9's version of that, okay? Intensive subsistence, intensive commercial, extensive subsistence, extensive commercial. We will talk about what that looks like, okay? And I will give you examples of what those are. And you will ultimately need to be able to explain and identify various examples, okay? So let's jump into that. So agricultural regions, we are going to talk, we're coming at this from lots of different angles, okay, in an effort to help it make sense. So these are agricultural regions that we see in developing countries, okay, and you will see down here, okay, so this is the type of agriculture that's up here. You will see down here if it's intensive or extensive, and then most of these, well, I don't even want to say that. Okay, so quickly, pastoral nomadism, shifting cultivation, plantation, intensive subsistence, wet rice dominant, and then intensive subsistence, other crop dominant. So basically what this is telling you is intensive subsistence. So that means that you've got one family that is specifically planting crops to feed their family, and they are in a place where rice is your dominant crop, okay, specifically East and South Asia. And then intensive subsistence, same idea. One family is planting food to feed their family, but it's an other crop dominant. So this is other places in the world, not East and South Asia, okay, or Southeast Asia. So same, where the climate's not conducive to rice, okay? All right, then there's agricultural regions in the developed world. So developed, that's going to be Europe, US, Canada, right? Australia, right? Okay. So we've got grain, Mediterranean, commercial gardening and fruit. This is also called market gardening. Let me put that down. Market gardening. Dairy, ranching, and then mixed crop and livestock. Also, you'll see down here, extensive, extensive, intensive, intensive, extensive, extensive, okay? The ones over here, grain, Mediterranean, and commercial gardening and fruit, the money is coming from the crops. Over here with dairy, ranching, and mixed crop and livestock, the money is coming from animal products, okay? Obviously, dairying, you're gonna get your milk and your cream and your cheese. Ranching, that's where you're going to get your beef, and then mixed crop and livestock. Mixed crop and livestock is actually kind of a really cool idea. They grow crops, corn specifically, usually, corn, wheat, barley, that kind of stuff, hay. So they grow crops, but they grow crops specifically to feed the animals. And then the money actually comes from animal products. Okay, so again, you're going to get your beef or dairy products from your animals as well. Okay, so let's specifically look at intensive, big word, bold, big on the screen, intensive types of agriculture. So this is agriculture that involves greater inputs of capital and paid labor relative to the space being used. So inputs of capital, that means money. That could also mean technology. Paid labor, that's people working, okay, relative to the space being used. So you've got more money and more labor, and generally a smaller area is being farmed, okay? So let's look at what that looks like. So here's market gardening and fruit farming. Most dominant type of agriculture in the southeastern United States. This is where we get, apples, well, I've got a list down here. Apples, asparagus, cherries, lettuce, tomatoes, mushrooms. I would add avocados in here. I would add, basically nuts and fruit or vegetables that are grown in kind of smaller batches, smaller areas, sometimes on trees, right, or bushes. It's also called truck farming. You might hear that term. Market gardening and fruit farming is also referred to as truck farming because they load everything in the truck and the truck drives to market, basically. A lot of the workers come from migrant workers. So if we go back to our unit 2 and talk about migration, and we have that idea of circular migration where workers come in for a season and work and then they leave, that would be part of this idea. So reliant on migrant workers, fertilizers, and machinery. So this right here is where we get that greater input of labor and money and technology. These are the types of crops that they grow in market gardening and fruit farming. Okay. Now, notice here we are again, same idea. Market gardening and fruit, southeastern U.S., Southeast Australia. Okay. It has a long growing season and a humid climate. That's what we need for this type of gardening or this type of agriculture. It's accessible to a large number of consumers in the U.S., specifically the Northeast. Let's see, same trucks. Okay, one of the things, the crops are generally crops that end up in developed countries. These type of more specialized crops, think about asparagus, mushrooms, those kinds of things, cherries. We don't really see a need for them in developing countries, and so this tends to be more expensive crops, and kind of to fit the palate of people who can afford to buy them. This is a type of specialty farming. Spread to New England, among other places, farmers profitably growing crops targeted at affluent customers. Okay, affluent means wealthy. Okay, asparagus, peppers, mushrooms, strawberries, nursery plants, those kinds of things are all part of market gardening and fruit. All right, plantation, another type of intensive agriculture. Plantation you are going to see mostly in developing countries. We saw plantation farming in the United States earlier in our history, right? That's where we see you can actually still go to the South and visit plantations, tobacco plantations, cotton plantations, all of those types of crops that the South grew right around Civil War time. But now we see them much more common in developing countries. So currently they are located, here, let me just move this slide over a little bit. Located in the tropics and the subtropics. So we see a lot of plantations in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. These are cash crop ideas, right? Cotton, tobacco, sugarcane. You could add in bananas, coffee, okay? Cash crops. Crops that are specifically grown in developing countries, but to sell on a world market. Historically, where were plantations an important form of agriculture? We see that in the U.S. South, again, right around Civil War. A little before and a little after, right? Okay. So here we are, plantation, developing countries, tropical areas, form of agriculture, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia. Now, one of the things that's important to note that plantation farming, they may be located in these developing regions, but they're often owned by developed companies, okay? Companies that are located or centralized, have their headquarters in Europe or North America. So they're located, these plantations, located in the tropics or subtropics of developing regions, but often owned by Europeans or North Americans. Okay, so this is actually a form of neo-colonialism where we're actually doing business in developing countries, but the profits of that business still come back to the developed countries or the people who have neo-colonized this region. Crops are grown on a large scale for export to developed countries for sale on a global market. Okay. Mixed crop and livestock. Let me just again move that over a little bit. It's the most distinctive characteristic is the integration of crops and livestock. Most of the crops that are grown are fed to the animals, and the manure gives soil fertility, right? So it's this kind of cyclical, symbiotic relationship where the crops are grown to feed the animals then eat the crops, produce the milk or the cheese or the cream or whatever it is we're harvesting from them. The manure that they then discard is collected and used as fertilizer back for the crops, okay? It also allows the farmers to more evenly distribute the workload throughout the year, right? So during the year, they're growing crops, or during the growing season, so this would be spring through fall, they're growing crops, and then in the winter, late fall, winter, early spring, they are using those crops and focusing their attention more on the animals. Corn and soybeans are the most important crops in the U.S. mixed commercial farming region. Okay, because again, as I said as I'll say in a later video, corn and soybeans both have lots of nutrients, but one of the biggest nutrients is calories and fat. And so they're great to feed animals because they help the animals bulk up. All right. So again, mixed crop and livestock, most of the crops are fed to the animals, not humans. We see that happening in the Midwest and Central Europe is where we find mixed crop and livestock. If you drive through the Midwest in the United States, that's pretty much all you see. Nearly all land is devoted to crops, but 75% of the income comes from animal products. Pigs are bred directly on farms, cattle brought in for fattening on, on corn. Workload distribution is distributed throughout the year. The livestock can be, dealt with year round, but the crops obviously are seasonal. Income variations are less pronounced. Okay, so it's kind of a more steady stream of income because you're doing something year round. In mixed commercial farmings, corn is the most important crop, followed by soybeans. The Iowa Corn Belt is the most important area in the United States for this type of agriculture. All right, now let's talk about extensive. Extensive is agriculture that uses fewer inputs of capital and paid labor relative to the space being used. So generally when we think of extensive, we think of big areas of land. Okay. All right, shifting cultivation. I kind of gave you an introduction to this idea already, but the idea is that farmers clear land for planting by slashing vegetation and then burning the debris. Shifting cultivation is often sometimes called slash and burn. Okay, slash and burn agriculture. Farmers grow crops on a cleared field for only a few years until the soil nutrients have been depleted, and then they leave it to do something called fallow. They leave it to fallow for many years so the soil can recover. The idea is that they are going to come back after 5 years or 10 years or however long they want to leave the soil to fallow. What fallow means is they basically just leave it alone. They let the weeds come back in and the trees come back in, and everything is going to start, vegetation is going to start taking over again. And the longer they wait, the more vegetation they get, so that when they do ultimately come back, there's something else to burn and they can reuse the field. But sometimes they can leave a field to fallow for, 10, 15, even 20 years. And so they need lots of fields to do this with, which, again, is one of those contributing factors of deforestation. And it's hard for this type of farming. It's not sustainable is ultimately what it comes down to, okay? This can also introduce us to this idea of intertillage. Intertillage is when you can grow lots of different crops. So let's say we just burned a field, it's good to go. So the crops that require lots of nutrients, I can do that first, right? And then I can take whatever's left of those nutrients, I can till that back into the soil, I can burn everything again, and then the field is still good to go, but maybe not for that type of crop that I initially planted because it requires too many nutrients and the soil has now been a little bit depleted. And so now I'm going to grow a different type of crop that will still do well with what I have left in my soil. Okay, so you can grow multiple types of crops, not just one. All right, shifting cultivation again. You find shifting cultivation in the tropical regions of Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. Specifically high temperatures and abundant rainfall. This practice is common in the tropical rainforests of developing regions, okay? Because it gives them lots of vegetation that they need to burn. But it also contributes to the deforestation of those tropical rainforests. This is a huge issue in the Amazon and in the Congo rainforest in Africa. Farmers clear land by planting by slashing vegetation, burning the debris, slash and burn agriculture. The burning of the vegetative debris infuses nutrients into the soil that's vital for farming. Farmers grow crops on a cleared field for only a few years until soil nutrients are depleted. Then they move on to another plot of land. So these are characteristics. Crops are often intermingled. The plot of land is not abandoned forever, right? They leave it to fallow until they can come back and it's recovered enough that they could use it again. The land is owned by a village, not an individual, right? So this is sort of a community endeavor. The future is uncertain as there is extensive pressure to protect the rainforests. And so what we see happening is more and more this idea of shifting cultivation or slash and burn agriculture is becoming illegal in a lot of places because we want to protect the rainforests. And so we are sending in people to help train the local communities on more sustainable types of agriculture. All right, nomadic herding. We don't see this much at all anymore. It's almost like, an agricultural endeavor of the past, but it does still exist in certain places around the world. So nomadism is the idea that there is no set home, that if it's a tribe or a family or a community that is, they move. They're not settled in one particular place. And generally when they move, it is to follow this herd as they take it around in search of water and food. Okay, so they depend primarily on animals rather than crops for survival. They herd domesticated animals in dry climates where planting crops is impossible, right? And so herding is an option because the land is not conducive to farming. You can't grow crops there. It's too dry and it's generally too hot, okay? So the examples that still exist, the Bedouins of Saudi Arabia and North Africa, the Maasai of East Africa are still nomadic herders. Okay, again, pastoral nomadism, drylands of Southwest Asia, North Africa, Central Asia, and East Asia. You find nomadic herder or pastoral nomadism in dry regions of the world. This idea of the hunter and gatherer, you guys probably are familiar with that term from when you studied Native Americans last year. Hunters and gatherers they don't really exist much in the world anymore, but humans survived by men hunting and fishing for animals and women gathering berries, nuts, fruits, and roots. They lived in small groups of 50 or less and traveled frequently. Today, there are still about 250,000 people who live this way. This would be, if we go back to the demographic transition model, this is stage 1, okay? Pastoral nomadism is almost like a throwback to this idea. It's a form of subsistence agriculture based on the herding of domesticated animals in dry climates where planting crops is impossible. They depend primarily on animals for survival. Animals are specifically selected based on the climate and the vegetation suitability, right? So obviously if you are trying to herd sheep, you need to be in an area where there's going to be enough vegetation that the sheep can eat, right? If there isn't, then you need to pick a different animal. This is a term you may hear, transhumance. It's the seasonal migration between mountains and lowland pasture area. Basically the idea that the herd summers in one place and winters in someplace else. And so cowboys, herders will move these huge herds of animals from one spot to another seasonally. If you've ever seen the movie City Slickers, it's hilarious and fabulous. I actually really like that movie, but it's kind of based around this idea of seasonal migration between mountains and lowlands. However, it is declining due to increased modern technology, improving transportation and other communication networks. We don't really need to move them anymore. If we moved them before because it was too cold in the winter to keep them in their original location, then now we have an ability to bring them inside, keep them warm, et cetera, right? So modern technology and improved transportation doesn't really, those advances mean that we don't really have to move herds as often as we used to in this way. Okay, livestock ranching. This, again, when I talk about livestock ranching, I just get pictures in my head of like old Western movies. So livestock ranching, specifically cows and sheep. Those are the two big ones, two most important ranched animals. Ranching is the commercial grazing of livestock over an extensive area, okay? Big land needed for livestock grazing or livestock ranching. This type of agriculture is best suited to dry climates, but due to increased irrigation practices, most land that used to be ranching has been converted for crops. So we're kind of seeing ranching become less and less of a thing. There are still areas in our country where you're going to find ranching. Wyoming and Montana are big ones. The other big area for ranching in the world is down in Brazil. They have huge expanses of grasslands, which are ideally suited for ranching. So ranching, extensive, commercial. Okay, so again, ranching, extensive. You find it in developed regions, although more and more in developing, that is transitioning. Because of irrigation. So if you are in a wealthy country that can afford to put the technology in required to move water and irrigate and fertilize the soil for crops, then that means you're developed, right? Developing countries can't afford to do that. They don't have the money or the resources, which means that ranching is getting shifted to a lot more developing countries. But where we see ranching, dry lands of Western United States, Western North America, Southeast Latin America, so that's the Brazil area, Central Asia, and then Sub-Saharan Africa and the South Pacific. We see a lot of ranching. We also, let me move that back over. We are losing our status. I don't ever like it when we lose our status, but we are losing our status as being the lead ranching kind of producer. So the U.S. is the leading producer of chicken and beef, but the most growth in commercial ranching has been happening in developing countries, as I just said. So China is now the leading producer of meat. They produce more than 2 times as much as we do. They overtook us in 1990. U.S. is the second biggest meat producer. Thanks to irrigation and hardier crops, most of the previously ranched land has been converted over to growing crops because growing crops is more profitable. Brazil is our third leading ranching area. The Pampas are grasslands. In Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay are devoted to grazing cattle and sheep. The cattle industry in Argentina has exploded. Ocean access opened up overseas markets, and so we see huge ranching endeavors going on down in South America, especially Eastern South America. Cattle and sheep, 2 most important widely ranched animals. All right, topic 5.2, settlement patterns and survey methods. This should be a refresher on what one of the things that we talked about back in Unit 1. Okay, so our enduring understanding for this one, same idea, the availability of resources and cultural practices, influence agricultural practices and land use patterns. So now we're going to specifically talk about settlement patterns and survey. So hopefully this looks familiar to you. This is my fabulous artwork. We've got a road, we've got a river, and then we've got these various assortments of settlements, okay, that hopefully give you an idea of what different types of settlements are. So linear settlements are settlements that are made in a line. Random, obviously, there's no pattern or no specific organization. A cluster is when everything's close together. An agglomeration is when everything is close together, but there's some sort of central point, right? Like a town square, something like that. Scattered is when there is some sort of pattern, but it's kind of spread out. Sinuous is when it kind of follows this wave idea. Generally sinuous, you will find as it kind of follows a road or follows a river. But here's all of our different settlements, okay? Now, rural settlement patterns. Which of these images would be dispersed, clustered, and linear? So we just kind of talked about what those look like. Dispersed is another word for scattered. Scattered. So in this case, we see this is going to be linear because it's in a line, right? Dispersed is going to be over here. Okay, so dispersed, linear. Dispersed because it's spread out, right? We can see houses, but they're very kind of far apart.
Group 1 dismissed.
And then clustered is over here with what looks like a town. Land survey patterns. So land survey patterns, again, this is a throwback to Unit 1, but it's how land was divided up and kind of today how we see fields being used. So metes and bounds, methods of land description, which involves identifying distances and directions and makes use of both the physical boundaries and the measurement of the land, right? So this is like my land goes from the big tree over to the rock, and then we border the river, right? That's metes and bounds. Township and range, very rigid, very linear. Rectangular land division scheme designed by Thomas Jefferson to disperse settlers evenly across farmlands in the U.S. interior. Okay, so township and range was used during that big land grab when we're trying to achieve
Group 2 dismissed.
manifest destiny, and we get very organized sections of land dispersed all the way across the Midwest and West. And then long lots, it's a settlement pattern in southern Quebec and some areas of Canada where lots, individual lots tend to be long and narrow and extend back from major rivers or roads, right? So this would be the river, and then everyone wants access to the river. And so the lot goes long behind them and narrow next to each other. And then again, this is straight from our Unit 1. So metes and bounds is this one, township and range is that one, and then long lots is that one, okay? And that is it for this first lecture. The second lecture is already up in Canvas as well, so you guys are good to just start listening. And we will use class time not for lecture,
Group 3 dismissed.
but for activities. All right, thanks guys. Thanks for listening.